chance to compete with
Ladies and
Germany
gentlemen,
on 6%,
thank you for coming. I'm
on Japan
delighted
lower,
to welcome
on
you here in
Switzerland
Brussels
lower. How
to
would we
this
have a
very
chance
timely and
that would
important
be pushing our
discussion on
problems
Europe's
into the
energy price
future, taking a
crisis
few artificial
in
jobs
partnership
now,
with
not
Aurora
many,
Energy
just a
Research
few,
and Future
and then having
Institute
a
for
bigger
Sustainable
inflation and an even
Transformation.
bigger unemployment. It would also
Today, we are
descend all of
discussing
these
how
in
to
Spain.
emerge from the
Look, I'm going to
crisis and how
diminish the
to
value
build
of your
a
savings
sustainable
deliberately.
backbone for
I'm
Europe's
going to make it
industry.
more expensive to invest.
But before
Look,
I hand it over to
who's
my
replaced it
colleague,
in the past?
I would like to
The
say a
government of
few
which I
words
was a
about
member,
United Europe.
1970 to 1975.
Our mission
We did a
is
big
to
reflation in
enable and to
1973.
nurture
It
cross-border
ultimately led to the
cooperation
highest rate of
between
inflation this country's ever
companies,
had,
individuals,
18 months or so later.
policymakers,
And
and
we were
especially the
panic-stricken.
young
And
Europeans
eventually,
through dialogue and
shortly after
exchange.
that, in another year or so, we had to go to the IMF. It led to a property boom. It led to a secondary
Please
bank
consider
collapse.
becoming a
All
member
of
of
that led
United
eventually
Europe.
to a
For
much
us, we
higher level
truly
of
believe that
unemployment,
today's
1.6 million.
challenges
Then we had
need
to try
European
to deal with
answers.
that high inflation.
Now, with no
Then
further
Mr.
ado, I would
Callahan
like to hand it
replaced
over
in
to my colleague
78,
Hanns
and
Koenig,
we've gone through the whole of
who's
the.
a member
Please don't
at
go
United
that way.
Europe and
Let's
head of
do it in a
Commission
sound
projects
way
at
this
Aurora
time.
Energy
Really
Research,
competitive,
and
sound,
your
honest,
host for
honorable
today.
money.
10 years ago, and it's so cheap, and it's going to put pressure on the Russians and on the Algerians and on the Norwegians to lower their prices. So we create a global market in gas. Well, I think the reality today is we have a global market in gas, LNG, pipeline gas together. The costs have narrowed, but transaction costs between them have narrowed. And then we arrive in 2022 or 2021, and we're actually surprised that the price of gas goes up. Well, it's been something which is relatively obvious for some time, that once gas becomes available globally, then in any economic recovery as we've just had, then Asia will be as important as Europe in looking for gas. And people talk a lot about the Ukraine and about Russia and about Gazprom, etc. But I just want to say it clearly now, everything we are experiencing in the gas market worldwide is mainly driven by the recovery in demand globally, by the switch in Asia, in particular in India and China, from coal to gas for energy, primarily for air pollution reasons and not for reasons of CO2 reduction. And then Europe, who has traditionally regarded itself as relatively safe and secure with both LNG and pipeline gas, suddenly discovers that it's actually got high prices of gas. Now, we're going to come on later on in the discussion as to how we deal with this in the future. It's obviously essential to look at the short term, what we can do in the short term, how much we should intervene in markets, how little we should intervene in markets, and what we should do in the long term, which includes necessarily the investments in renewable energy and in other aspects of the climate transition, which he referred to as well. So we've got a challenge immediately on the issue of the affordability of energy to everyone. How can governments help communities, those who are more vulnerable, to cope with these bills? How can we ensure that our industry remains competitive in the short term? At the same time, in the longer term, we have the prospect of actually reaping the harvest of investments which are at present in progress towards a low carbon economy. So that's my introduction.
Thank you very much for your introductory statement and the historical context. I think extremely useful, and I completely agree that it's been a long time in the making. And of course, there are short-term triggers, but it's not just about Russia in the near term. Next is Simone Mori. Simone has been head of Europe at Enel since 2018. And as such, he's in charge of Enel's European activities outside Italy and Iberia, as well as the relationship with the EU stakeholders. I hope I got that right. Enel is Europe's largest utility by market capitalization, and that isn't by chance, because I think it's pretty evident the market capitalization is that high because Enel saw opportunities in the energy transition much sooner than other European utilities, and changed tack basically from fossil fuels towards renewables and grids much earlier than most others. And Simone was very much involved in this transition in roles covering policy, research and development, and human resources prior to taking up his current role. So it's great to have you here, Simone. The floor is yours.
Many thanks for inviting me and taking part in this panel. Talking about market dynamics after Philip put me some pressure, but anyway, it's true that it enables me to elaborate further on the topic, starting from the history, because unfortunately, when you talk about history, it means you are pretty old. But we did something in this area, and it's true that we have been working a lot in Europe in order to create a power market where with a reasonable level of liquidity, freedom of choice, promoting investments, and the idea was, changing a market which was previously based on long-term ties between the different segments of the value chain, which was completely detrimental when we were dealing with competition needs. We already knew at that time that there were problems coming from volatility, coming from the risk of a boom and bust cycle for investments. And indeed, we discussed together with Philippa some data. If you look at the power sector in the last 20 years, a relatively small share of the investment in the sector have been carried out just according to the purely short-term market prices, which is a reality. It's not good or not bad, it's a reality. I mean, nothing bad. After the gas crisis started to blow up, there was a kind of an attack to the idea of windfall profits. Now, windfall profits are the translation in the power market of how all the industries work. At least I'm not an economist, but what I learned from the books is that markets work according to the marginal cost, marginal price mechanism, which is every market, including the microphone ones. So the problem is that when you put in this model the need to achieve different objectives, which are not just the short-term market equilibrium, this mechanism starts to become dysfunctional, and this is a reality. That's not by chance that once, for the first time with the 2020, the European institutions said, okay, guys, you have to build some renewables. Well, in order to get these investments done, you had to look outside the market dynamics because the market signal were not enough to bring investment into the renewable side. We need feed-in tariffs, green certificates, tender, and so on and so forth. It's not by chance that when we had, few years ago, a big discussion with the Commission officers about how to manage the security of supply and how to take under control the investment cycles. So the capacity market, it was a kind of theoretical, philosophical discussion. Is the capacity market an emergency short-term measure, transitory measure, or has to become an inherent part of the market design? It has to tackle market failures, it has to be a tool, a pillar of the market. That's the same for how you manage flexibility, how you manage a balancing market. But the reality is that the present short-term market, which has been built according to the need of finding a proper way to dispatch thermoelectrical plants, is completely dysfunctional where you want to bring a result of massive investment in renewable, whose cost structure is completely different. So you need something which is more stable, long-term oriented, which close the gap between, for example, price and average production cost of. So, sorry for this a bit theoretical introduction, but I think it's important because when the gas prices clashed, and European customers, families, and companies start to be victims of a phenomenon that we define the double marginality. You have the impact of marginal price in the gas market because of the TTF volatility, which translates to all the gas contracts indexed to TTF, which translates to the gas fueled power plants, which produces the marginal electricity in the many power markets. So there's a phenomenon of double marginality. So people say, oh, what's that? That this is not working. So what is the reaction? First reaction is let's kill the system marginal cost system into the power markets, which is the solution, for example, put in place in Spain, which we believe is a big mistake for two reasons. First one, because, for three reasons. First one, because basically there is again a philosophical mistake. You say, okay, the world is perfect, but I don't like the outcome of this world. So let's kill the outcome, not let's kill the world, which is strange. No? The world is not perfect. You have to change the root cause. Second point, you are not looking at the root cause of the problem, which is the gas price in TTF. You are looking at the consequence, which is a quite strange way to manage a problem. Third one is that this is clearly a domestic solution. That's by chance that it is allowed for a country, Spain, whose interconnection with the rest of Europe is relatively small and which doesn't depend so much on Russian gas. But this is the first step for further fragmentation of the market. So, coming to a conclusion, with my colleagues here in Brussels, we started to border EU commissioners and staff a few years ago saying we have to develop a new market model for power sector, which has to be even more integrated, even more coherent, based on some kind of structured long-term demand for all you need in terms of power. So energy, decarbonization, flexibility, security of supply. And there are different technicalities. It's a complex mix of bottom-up market dynamics and top-down, if you want, planning and dirigism. But this is what you need if you want to achieve this kind of complex results in terms of decarbonization. So we started by far before the crisis, but we are pretty happy to say that the solution we saw at that time in order to enable investment in renewable is the same solution we may put in place now in a shorter term in order to manage this big gap between the marginal prices coming from the market and the average cost of production. So basically, getting rid of a market which is short-term, volatile, and based on marginality, going toward a market which is much more based on long-term contracts, which brings to a price which is closer to the average cost of production and gives a much better signal for investing or disinvesting in specific technologies.
Thank you very much, Simone, and certainly plenty of food for discussion in there. Our next speaker is Tjobjorg Klara Fossum, who is in charge of Equinor's global activities in carbon capture and storage, which is great because Equinor is actually one of a handful of companies, really only that have operating carbon capture and storage (CCS) assets. They were the first to open up geologic carbon storage in the Sleipner field in the North Sea in 1996. So really trailblazers in this field. Before her current role, Tjobjorg had an illustrious career at Equinor and Statoil, as it was called before, in the company's pipeline business, but also in subsea mapping and in the new energy solutions business of Statoil. Then, so it's great to have you here. The floor is yours, Tjobjorg.
Thank you so much, and also thank you for the opportunity to be here today. At the moment, we are certainly concerned with the war in Europe and the energy crisis. And on top of that, climate changes and climate crisis does not go away. I mean, net zero in 2050 may seem far in the future, but when you consider the scale of the challenge with the transition, it's massive. So we need to have action on that part as well. So we basically need to manage 3 crises at the same time. We need to use a broad toolbox to manage this energy transition. And what I would like to try during my introduction today is to elaborate a little bit on why Equinor is not only investing into renewable, but to a broader toolbox, and carbon capture and storage is certainly part of that. So I guess the fundamental challenge is that the energy system today, it is dominated by fossil fuels. And fossil fuel, they have the advantage that they store, a lot of energy. And you can relocate that energy to where you need it, and you can use it when you need it. But then the drawback is that it emits CO2 when you use it. So it's different with electricity, or it's different with renewable energy that creates electricity, because you have to use the electricity when it's generated. It doesn't store energy. You can store it, but then you need an add-on, like a battery. But unfortunately, the amount of energy you can store in a battery is only a small fraction on the amount of energy in fossil fuels. So just to put that into perspective, to understand that, if you have one ship that is loaded with natural gas, the amount of energy in that ship is the same as a whole year production from one of our wind farms offshore, Sheringham Shoal. And that's a pretty large wind farm. It's 88 turbines. It gives fuel or electricity to 200,000 UK homes. So 1 year of production, same energy as one ship. So if you think about that, and you then look at the energy system in Europe today, where you have one part fueled by electricity. Today that electricity is clean and dirty, and you have 3 parts with fossil fuel. And all this needs to become clean. It's a massive challenge, and you have to use, the broad toolbox. Decarbonising the energy-intensive segments such as steel, such as cement, other industries that require a lot of energy, decarbonising or having clean backup electricity that can deliver when renewable doesn't deliver or there are seasonal fluctuations, and long-range transport. So this is where carbon capture and storage comes into the equation. And as you said, CCS, carbon capture and storage, is something we've been doing a lot for a long time in Equinor. We have 25 years of operational experience. We know the technology works. We know it can be done in a safe and sustainable way. And at the moment, we are now developing Northern Lights, where we are building a CO2 transport and storage infrastructure for industry. So basically, industry in Europe, they can capture their emissions, bring it to the harbor, and the Northern Lights will then come and pick it up by a ship, bring it to Norway, and store it permanently. This project is happening very much now, and the construction work is ongoing. We will be ready in 2 years. And Northern Lights is part of a full CCS value chain, which is called Longship, which is subsidized by the Norwegian state. So that means that it's not only the transport and storage part that gets support, it's also 2 capture plants in Norway. 1 cement factory and 1 waste-to-energy factory. So in that way, we are developing the whole value chain in parallel. So we get around this chicken and egg situation. And there is spare capacity in Northern Lights. So Northern Lights is out in Europe marketing this spare capacity. And we really have to say that we are overwhelmed by the interest. We see, capture projects being matured by a broad range of industry, cement, steel, waste-to-energy, direct air capture even, power and refineries. And to put it that way, Northern Lights is certainly oversubscribed. So we have to mature more storage sites. And we are on that task. So we were thrilled. Just before Easter, the Norwegian government awarded us 2 more storage licenses. One of them is called Smeheia. It has a huge potential to store 20 million tons a year. So we are now looking into a pipeline solution to transport the CO2 from Europe to the Norwegian continental shelf. And why are we doing that? It's because if we can go from ship to pipeline, we can really reduce the cost of CO2 transport and storage, and that will of course benefit European industries. So we see a lot of momentum in our project, through our projects. But having said that, this is not a walk in the park. I mean, there is a commercial gap today between what it costs to implement CCS, for example, for an industry, and the cost of emitting the CO2 and paying the taxes. So we have to close that gap. And the only way we can close that gap is to work together, industry and government. I mean, these first capture projects, they will need support to get realized, to close that gap that is there today. But they are so important. They are the pioneering project. And if we manage to initiate this first wave of CCS project, they will pave the way for cost reduction based on scale, based on industrialization and technology improvement. And in the same period as we realize this first project, we expect the CO2 cost, the CO2 taxes to go up, and eventually they will cross. But to get there, we need to work together. And I would say that the governments, EU and industry are already working together on this, but we need to do more. We need to strengthen this. And we really call for a EU internal market strategy for CCS, the same way as we have for hydrogen. Yes, so I end there. Thank you.
Excellent. Very, very impressive to hear what Equinor is doing there. Next, we have Marc-Oliver Arnold. Marc-Oliver is the plant director of Georgs Marienhütte, which is the core plant of GMH Group, a major German steel producer. Before that, he was a managing director of Diekerhoff Guss, a specialized cast iron manufacturer that is also part of GMH Group, and had various other positions in the cast iron industry. GMH, for context, is one of Germany's largest single consumers of electricity at more than 1 terawatt hour per year, and also has very ambitious plans to move towards the production of fully green steel, which I'm sure Marc-Oliver will tell us more about. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here with you. And steel making in Germany, it's a pleasure, but it's also a pressure. Because we see a climate crisis, we've heard about it, it's not over. And if you do the steel production in the traditional way, you have blast furnaces where you have a vast output of CO2, which is not good for the climate, as we all know. So we in our company have 14 production sites in which we have 3 electro arc furnaces, and that is lucky for us because we only need electricity and a little bit of process coal to melt the steel. We have a completely circular turn. We only use scrap to make some very high quality steel. And so also the slag we produce in a year, we also use in a circular economy to bring other products, so as for the road construction. So we are very defined with our processes, and now we have the energy crisis. Our idea was to transform our steel production into a green steel production. And green steel production is, I think, the future of the steel production, because we have the aim not to harm our earth, but to save our earth. Besides that, one fact, steel as a construction material is the most important construction material that we have today. And so we need steel, besides all of the crisis scenarios we've heard about. How will we manage to produce steel in the future? Only if we are able to produce the steel we need for the future in an environmental way that allows us to be yeah, on the top of the green steel movement, I would say so. And I think just to be on the consumer side, we need energy not only in electricity energy, as Hanns said, 1 terawatt. To give you an impression, Germany as a whole country has 507 terawatt a year annual consumption. So this is a lot. And we experience a lot of problems in the moment to get this electricity in a green level. And not only green washed, but really green. This is our aim, because the other things don't bring us to the goal. And yeah, I think also the second energy we use in a great amount is natural gas. And we need this natural gas to reheat the continuous casted bars for the milling process, for the rolling process. And we also think that we are ready to use hydrogen for that, not natural gas, but hydrogen. But in the moment, we see a lot of problems to get this hydrogen. So we have a lot of problems to solve, but I think we can solve them.
That's what we have this panel for, right? So thank you very much. Next, we have Johanna Schiele, who is a policy officer at the European Commission in DG Klima and works on the Energy Innovation Fund. Johanna is also a dear friend and former colleague from Aurora, where she spent a couple of years working in our consulting team, and then unfortunately left us for the Harvard Kennedy School to go back and do another master's, and now is at the Commission. But it's great to see Aurora alums going places. So great to have you on the panel, Johanna, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so I guess I'm representing the European youth, as we heard in the introduction today, and thank you for having me on this panel with all of you. My institutional memory doesn't go quite as far back. I joined the European Commission in February at the fund. Now it's working? Okay, I'll start again. Yeah, pleasure to be here. I'm with the European Commission since February with the Innovation Fund, where I joined to set up a CFD or CCFD scheme under the Innovation Fund. And I use my time to tell you a bit about our fund and what we do, and then link it back to what we said before. So the Innovation Fund is one of the world's largest clean tech funds. We are funded from the European emissions trading system. So at the moment, at carbon prices of roughly 75 euros per ton, we have a funding volume of about 38 billion euros until 2030. And our aim is basically the title of this event. We want to help to build the sustainable backbone for Europe and help creating the technologies, bringing them to market and making them cheap enough to be deployed, that we now know we will need in 10 or 15 years. So we're very much looking at industry decarbonization, steel, cement, refineries, chemicals, advanced renewables, and CCS as well. And actually in my team, we also host the CCS directive. So yeah, we're not a very old fund, but it's going quite well. We have been so far largely oversubscribed. We're funding through 3 instruments. We have funding through grants, which are given out in a large scale and a small scale call. This year's large scale call has just closed with a funding volume of 1.5 billion euros. And we had applications for projects worth more than 12 billion euros in investment. So the interest is huge. And we're really looking at how we can fund the best projects and fund the most important projects for the long-term energy transition. We're also giving loans via the EIB and with Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is Bill Gates' climate tech fund. And now we're broadening our portfolio of instruments to include CFDs or CCFDs, so contracts for difference or carbon contracts for difference, as a way of introducing more competition, more price competition and a market mechanism into the way that we give out grants. And these CCFDs will very likely be directed at the decarbonization of heavy industry, so steel, cement, and so on. And yeah, I guess this brings us a bit to the energy crisis that we have right now, and also the Repower EU directive, because as a fund that has a long-term goal, being in a crisis is on the one hand good and on the other hand really difficult. On the one hand, there's a lot of momentum to act, and we don't struggle in terms of defending the budget that we have and even enlarging it in Parliament in the ETS directive revision. But on the other hand, it's very tempting to spend money on short-term things that, for example, should replace Russian gas in the short term. And I quite like communicating dilemmas rather than saying everything can be achieved with a single measure. And I know there's this narrative of this crisis accelerating the transition and making the transition easier. But I think it's healthy to communicate that a crisis is a crisis, and needing money for yet another thing, which is replacing Russian gas, will not necessarily make things only easier. Of course, it's putting more pressure on going towards electrification and decarbonization everywhere, but also it requires investment for new things like new LNG terminals and new infrastructure and higher gas prices. And that is taking money away from investments in the green transition that we could make. So maybe I'm a bit on the pessimistic side here. But yeah, this is basically the dilemma that the Innovation Fund is also in, that we want to fund excellence and technologies that we now know we will need in 10 years. But on the other hand, there's a lot of pressure to act in the short term. And that dilemma we're trying to navigate.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Johanna. By the way, I see a couple of people standing there in the back. We do have a couple of chairs up front here. If you would like to take a seat, I mean, you don't have to, but it might be more comfortable. Okay, just to start with the discussion here on the panel, I'd like to turn back to you, Marc-Oliver, and drill a little bit down on the current crisis and how it's affecting you, because you said, okay, you're struggling to get enough green electricity, but that hasn't been. That's not a struggle that only started a couple of months ago, right? I mean, that's a longer term issue. How have the price increases over the past months affected you? Is it something you can simply pass on to your customers, or is it worsening your competitive position in the global game?
Yeah, in the moment we see higher prices, even highest prices. And we only have the chance to give these costs to our customers. So we are not able to take these costs on ourselves. And so this is not only the costing for the energy, natural gas or electricity that concerns us. It concerns us also that it has a vast price impact on consumables, a vast impact on alloys. We've had even a vast impact on scrap. And so we see in the moment, and we experience a price rally that really affect us on so many parts. And so we have to give these higher costs and higher prices to our customers. And so we hope that our customers can also take these costs to their customers. And so we have a circular economy once more. But it's not a good situation. Because if you give so much pressure into the customer relations, this is never good. Yeah. And also, I think if we think in a global view, we have not in all the parts of the world the same price rally. So this is not good for our competitiveness.
Yeah, yeah. absolutely. I'd like to turn to you, Simone, and Tjobjorg, because Enel and Equinor might be taken to be net beneficiaries of the current crisis, given that you produce the very scarce commodities that everyone wants right now. Would you agree with that hypothesis, or not?
You know, I would like to. I would like to. Unfortunately, how the evidence is showing it's not like this because the explosion of the prices in the market has a different impacts on different companies according to how those companies are positioned in the value chain. But basically, I mean, there are several points to be highlighted. The first one is that a large part of the energy in many of the markets where we are, which is utilized today, was priced according to maybe 1 year contracts, which had been signed before the crisis. So it's very often many utilities, including us, have to buy, for example, at very high prices, the balancing energy in an incredibly short and volatile market in order to match the little bit of differences between the foreseen demand and actual energy which is utilized. So if you look at our numbers, but I think that the situation may not be generalized, but many utilities in Europe have troubles because of that, because you sold at a cheaper price the energy before, and then you have to buy the difference according to your position between the generation and the retail, how much you produce, how much you sell. But I mean, basically, it is a quite generalized situation. Second, is that in several of the markets where we are, there were regulatory intervention creating chaos. This is also one of the reasons probably why the stock market reacted in our case, and that's what, again, quite a general issue for utilities in a negative way. They should be very happy for that. They are not. And one of the reasons is that there was those measures, more or less all the countries. The countries where we are probably the most impactful have been in Romania and partially in Spain. Then even if the financial impact is not huge, in some cases it is, but in many cases it's not huge, but the rational market is, what's going on? That's dangerous. They perceive a very big increase in terms of danger. A third problem, which is I think quite common, not only on utilities but also on the gas companies. I have colleagues from this sector may confirm that, is that the incredible volatility in the market is creating some pressure on the companies because of the so-called margining effects, so the guarantees that you have to give to the counterpart of the market, to the organized market, in order to keep under control the risk coming from this volatility. So the overall impact, I would say, in many companies in the sector, for sure, is not a positive impact. Of course, you may have cases of so-called windfall profits here and there in some part of the subsectors of the segment or some part of the energy sector. But according to many analyses, going back to my previous point, apparently the player who has getting the most benefits from the situation are the Russian exporters. And probably the solution is not, changing the domestic power rules of the game.
Thank you very much. Would you agree?
I would agree that the picture is complex. And we have this, we have the energy crisis, the war, and the climate crisis. And I think it's in this Equinor and Norway, we are doing what we can to supply more energy to Europe, but at the same time, we are continuing to invest in the energy transition. So yes, I think it's clear that at the moment, due to the market prices, there are higher income there. But we don't believe that these prices will last forever. It is a volatile market, and our business has to kind of thrive and be sustainable in a volatile market. I think it's what I would like to emphasize is that in Equinor we are keeping a steady course. We are committed to the energy transition, and I guess one way to look at it is that income of today serve investment of tomorrow. And on that note, we've stated that by 2030 we will invest half of our investment in renewable and clean energy, which will serve Europe with stable clean energy in the energy transition as well.
Excellent. I'd like to turn to Johanna and Philip and ask a very similar question regarding the net impact of the current crisis, but on the European Green Deal. Do you think the crisis is net positive or net negative for the European Green Deal as a whole?
Okay, I have a go. I think it's a very difficult picture. I don't have a clear answer. I think there's quite a lot of reasons why it's going to accelerate the Green Deal. I think now a level of urgency has arrived with everyone, even the last people that didn't get it before. Consumers, companies, member states, really everyone's feeling the urgency now. I also think that the term security of supply has taken on a slightly... Before, we often discussed security of supply in the context of intermittent renewables and the difficulty of managing intermittency. But now security of supply is also in the public debate in terms of gas simply not being available or prices being very volatile. And lastly, high and volatile prices do have an effect on consumption and simply make green sources even more competitive than before. But also on the downside, I think that high gas prices are not great for the public perception of the energy transition. I think a lot of people, including very good journalists on German television, mistake the gas price increase or attribute the gas price increase to the energy transition, to the CO2 price, this double marginality that we talked about before. It's a very difficult concept to communicate, and a lot of people, or it doesn't fully arrive in the public debate, I would say. So I think reputation-wise, it's not great. Then there have also been short-term actions in many member states, reopening coal plants, interfering with the market design, which I think are harmful in the long term. Yeah, and lastly, the point that I made before, I think we shouldn't underestimate how much money this costs us now, and that this money is missing on other ends later on. So I'm not sure. I think it will increase the urgency, and it will drive home the urgency of going faster with the green transition. But there's also a lot of downsides.
Yeah, well, picking up on what Johanna's just said, I mean, it's all very well to go out before a public audience and say, don't worry, all will be sorted out in 15 years' time. We're going to invest in a green future, and prices will come down. So you'll be okay. That's not how you convince people. Sorry. Can you hear me? Right. All right. Okay, sorry. You don't convince people by telling them that it's awful now, but it's going to be absolutely great in 10 years' time. You have to give them an idea, a precise idea as to how you deal with the current situation, while at the same time maintaining your commitment to future investments and the strategy, the pathway to clean, secure, sustainable, competitive energy. And, you know, I think there is a certain amount of pedagogy to be done on what makes up an electricity price. Only a third of an energy price is attributable to energy sources. It's 30% is tax or levies. I'm talking about the average for the European Union, and another 30% is systems costs. So I strongly recommend reading the two, and I'm not saying this as a former commission official, but I have this on good authority from Lowe Birnbaum, the Commission's two communications on what to do in the short term, the toolkit which it actually lists of things which governments can do without going in the bad direction which Simone rightly underlines, which is to try to fix outcomes in the market which ultimately change the incentives for companies. in principle, a higher gas price should encourage anyone on the pathway to net zero in a business to invest in cheaper alternatives. It must be that way. And in principle, someone faced now with very volatile electricity prices caused by gas has to look very carefully at how actually they are procuring gas. Why isn't there any move, as there is now, I think, in the renewable area, to competitive auctioning of energy requirements, which probably gives you a higher price than perhaps the pre-2019 spot price, but allows you to hedge against the volatility which exists. And I mean, I keep saying this to people who are a bit upset by energy prices, or a bit worried, why do we have to follow the rules of the market? Well, as long as markets have existed, people hedge their bets. They take out contracts to ensure that they actually are paying a more level price over a certain number of years. Now, if you talk to our former interlocutors in Gazprom about this, they always joking with me that you're all complaining about our long-term contracts for gas, but look now at the situation. You'd far prefer a long-term contract from us than to be the slave of these short-term price signals, which you get from your so-called Henry Hubs and the other sources of gas. So the energy short-term challenge is huge. It is in relation to price, but there are a number of things which governments can do to help consumers deal with that. They can also help industry in certain situations, and frankly, that means money transferring from one pot to another, but it needs to be done. And then for the longer term, if you are to help the markets work better in a cleaner way, then there's a crucial question. If you are faced with one option, which is leaving you more opportunities in the very short term, but sacrificing yourself in the long term, then I think you point in Johanna's direction of saying you've got to choose the second alternative, because that's the one which is really going to guarantee you independence of energy supply, security of supply. It's the one which is really going to give you clean energy, and it's the one which is going to, if you plan it right, you can source even fossil fuels on a basis which will stabilize the pricing around. The last thing I want to say is that people say that well, we need a new electricity market design. Each time we talk about this, every week they say, well, we need a new. No, we're in a bit of a mess. There are too many variables going on. Everyone on the road to net zero will have to deal with the mix of factors which they're faced with, including redirecting away from Russian gas, but even that costs years. It's not going to solve the problem straight away. So we may not have the ideal solution. It may be that we are muddling through for a couple of years.
And the crisis is probably not the right time to make very drastic changes to market design, which will then have consequences for years and decades to come. But that's just my opinion. I'd like to turn to what you said is the second option, or the second direction of seeing what we can do in the situation in the long term, and ask you, Johanna, if you can summarize for us what the European Commission has proposed with the Repower EU package 2 weeks ago, because that's obviously the strategy the Commission has for getting us out of the mess.
Yeah, sure. I'm also sure most people are familiar with the Repower EU plan, so I keep it short. Basically, Repower EU is the plan that the Commission has made to reduce the reliance on Russian gas, and it's built on 3 main pillars. The first one's on the demand side. We have to reduce energy consumption. Energy savings are extremely important. It's a point that always falls under the table. Similarly, the building sector always falls under the table. Energy savings in the building sector are extremely important. And any gas that we save now will really help us with storage levels next winter. So I think that's the first message that Repower EU should drive home. Then on the supply side, through supply diversification, this is a really difficult one. We heard before, the supply side is so tight, and this has also been shown in member states' negotiations for different gas contracts. They're really difficult, they're really slow going. There's simply not that many options. But we have to try our best, member states have to try their best, and where it's useful and sensible, joint procurement or coordinated procurement through the EU can be part of the solution. Also in the medium term for hydrogen, we've seen the H2 Global scheme by Germany, which is a hydrogen procurement scheme, thinking in this direction and coordinating energy demands on an EU level might help to some degree. And then lastly, substituting Russian fossil fuels by accelerating Europe's clean energy transition. And this definitely includes increasing renewables targets. It's always so easy to say we're increasing the targets, but obviously the real thing that stands behind this is accelerating the permitting process, finding the land where this can be built, going through public opposition through more renewables. This is hard work and work that has to happen on the member state level. We also need to produce more synthetic fuels, more hydrogen. The EU target is extremely ambitious. It's 20 million tons by 2030, of which roughly 10 million tons will have to be imported because it simply cannot be produced in the EU. And yes, these targets are very high. And it's always the difficult thing with a strategy like Repower EU. To what degree do you say, this is a target and here are the things that we need to do to achieve that target, versus this is the maximum in each area that we can achieve, and that's the target that these things add up to. So yeah, a bit of both bottom up and top down goals here. But what I do think is really positive about Repower EU is that it stresses the importance of thinking geopolitics, energy systems resilience, and the green transition together, and bringing all these elements together from the perspective not just of Klima and DG ENA, but of DG GROW, of all the other DG Comp, of all the other DGs that have to be involved in making a plan like that. So I think having this holistic picture helps at least to look at what will have to come.
Thanks, Johanna. Is it enough, Simone?
I don't know if there is something that may be enough today, but I think it goes in the right direction. Without picking up the specific points that we tend to share, I think that what Johanna said is very goes in the right direction, and I also believe that we may feel the difficulty of the Commission because the political pressure was very big and understandable. I mean, what Philip said, it's very understandable. I mean, we, as a company, we tend to blame politicians. It's a kind of sport for companies, no? And probably you are quite right. But if you are in the close of politician, you don't want to see your people in the street with pitchforks. I mean, that's something that you don't like to see. And even if we are, of course, what is very important is to keep separated the short-term measures. And my impression, probably I may say that, probably Johanna may not, is that when you decided to clusterize what the countries may do and what they can't, probably you look at what already existed and say, okay, we don't like it, but let's see. Don't do better than that. Don't do worse than that. Let's keep, in some case, a ring fence of what was already introduced at the level of member states. It's a perfect word, it's not, but it is understandable. On the other hand, it's very important not to deviate from the, let's say, the master plan. Also because I want to repeat this, also because the solution for the master plan is very much coherent to what you need now. So, for example, just a small example. For the first time, saying that every time you build something new, starting from a certain year, from a given year, you have to put a solar roof in your house, on your office, on your factory is incredibly important. So this compulsory top-down push for doing something that today it's clearly something needed because it's in the money. We have the technology. Probably you may overcome all the permitting problems because we believe that it's also very important what the Commission is trying to do in order to make enforceable the targets by speeding up the permitting at domestic level. And you have been much less shy that, until a few years ago, the Commission was very, very shy about the idea of pushing too much at the constraint for the member states in order, for example, to change the administrative rules for permitting. Now it's becoming an emergency. It's very good. It's very good. It's a reaction to the crisis, but it goes in the right direction. And I would say this is very, very coherent. What we have to do now is to accelerate and to avoid, we need some deviation. I mean, probably we wouldn't have discussed so much about building new LNG terminals in Europe 6 months ago. No, it's a deviation. But what we have to do is avoiding the deviations are undermining the master plan, which is pretty much clear and quite coherent what we need to do also to manage the crisis.
Thank you very much. From my perspective, there's a lot of very sensible things in the REPowerEU plan, but a lot of it actually isn't under the control of the European Commission, right? I mean, the European Commission can set targets for renewables build out in 2030. It needs to be done and implemented by the member states. So, Philip, how much can the European Commission really achieve there, or is it just paper?
Well, right. Okay. The first virtue of what the Commission is doing is saying, this is the direction we should go in, and this is a menu of the things which you could do while respecting the overall strategy for the future, and also respecting internal market rules, respecting state aid rules, etc., etc. Now, it may be that individual member states don't like some of that, because to be fair to ministers, they are the ones sitting in front of their television presenters and others and responding to the questions. And sometimes they want to jump on very short-term solutions, like let's put a cap on wholesale gas prices. Now, if you go in that direction, which the Commission is warning against, then you are actually on for a roller coaster ride as to know what will happen next when you've intervened. And so I think the Commission's role in setting out the alternatives is very useful. Going beyond that to saying you must do that is another question. And I found always the area of permitting extremely difficult. I think most domestic politicians feel the same thing. You go in some areas who hate onshore wind and others who love it. And as far as solar panels are concerned, I think the whole of Baden-Württemberg is already covered by solar panels on the roofs. So, and some member states are in a position to spend more money directly on things which impact their consumers, whereas if you're in the lower league of countries inside the EU who are contributing to this exercise, and some of them are on the Eastern European side of the European Union, but there are other less well-off countries elsewhere. To be doing what ideally the Commission proposes is not realistic. I mean, it's like take the example of Poland. It's all very well to say, we should remove coal from the energy mix. I started working in the Commission in the European Coal and Steel Community. I actually spent years trying to give loans to companies to re-employ redundant steel workers. In Saarland, in Lorraine, in the Ruhr, in Scotland, Wales, etc. It was a 25-year process. So when you're talking about asking member states to do something, you've got to take into account what is in the Green Deal as well, the notion of a just transition, which is you need to help these countries and these regions to do the transition. And I think that's sometimes missing as a message. Commission has it there in all its packages, but domestic politicians don't ask for help because they prefer to go for the direct solution, which is, in populist terms, is much easier for them. They don't say, we'll ask the Commission or we'll ask the Council for more money. And so I think giving a little bit of credit to national governments to use the flexibility they have, but also to have, in certain cases, a longer period of transition than others is the right way to go.
Yeah, thank you. Tjobjorg, your topic is CCS, of course. Do you see CCS losing a bit of traction in the current environment, given that fossil fuels are so expensive and could be for the next couple of years, or is it actually quite unaffected?
I think we actually see the opposite signals. That's what I alluded to in the introduction as well. We see a lot of interest for CCS. I guess it's a little bit about realities. I mean, when industry look at their options to decarbonize, it's very hard. They don't have many options. And CCS in many cases has to be part of it. And if you look at CCS, it can serve industry in two ways, basically. It can either capture the CO2 from the flue gas, from the industrial process, or it can capture the CO2 from the fuel before the fuel is being used. That's what we refer to as blue hydrogen. I mean, you reform the natural gas to hydrogen, combine it with CCS, and then you can produce a large amount of hydrogen, which is clean, and then it's then it is a solution for these energy-intensive industries. And I have to say that in Equinor, we are looking into both blue and green hydrogen. We think both is necessary. The advantage with blue hydrogen is that you can make it at scale, and it can pave the way with infrastructure, as an example, that both blue and green hydrogen can benefit.
Okay, so the longer term picture for CCS remains unchanged, and it's actually not so much impacted by high gas prices, because even blue hydrogen has gotten a lot more expensive, right? Because it's made from natural gas. But okay, great. Marc-Oliver, I'd like to zoom out a little bit and, before we open it up for questions. So if you have questions, think about what they might be. But do one final round on the panel and talk about the net zero Europe, the longer term outlook. And I'd like to start with you and ask you whether we will still have a steel industry in a decarbonized Europe, and especially in the center of the decarbonized Europe, or if we'll simply see the producers move to cheaper regions, to the Nordics, to the MENA region, where renewables are more abundant. And if we want to see it, what do we have to do to see it in Central Europe?
Yes, we will see a steel industry in Europe, and also a decarbonized steel industry, because it's the only way. Decarbonization, if you look at windmills will never function without steel. So steel is crucial for the transformation. And have we learned from the crisis? And we have seen a lot of crises. I will bring in mind the pandemic crisis. What have we learned? Have we learned that the production overseas is so secure that we also have the products we need in the time we want? Or have we learned that we maybe should take some strategic industries, and I think the steel industry is a strategic industry in Europe. And we as the steel producers, the steel makers, we will do any necessary step to decarbonize our production and to be the good neighbor, to be the green neighbor. Because we have learned a lot from deindustrialization, and these lessons I think were not so good, so great. And so I think we should do anything to have a steel industry.
Very, very clear statement. Thank you. I'd like to pick up the point on supply chain resilience you make, and turn to Simone, because Enel has actually some quite interesting plans on to move to solar cell manufacturing, which I think not a lot of utilities are. So could you tell us a bit about what is behind that, and what you would and whether you see this as an opportunity also to build a new or rebuild the European manufacturing industry there?
Well, behind that there are also 118 million euros from innovation funds. So since Johanna was mentioning that, but I don't want to know. Actually, this is a quite important investment we are carrying out in the south of Italy, in Sicily. And I think it's an important step, because for what we know is the only, if not one of the few, large significant investment on the value chain of renewable solar photovoltaic panels. That's high technology. The idea is to scale up a technology which is already working. It's clear, Philip was mentioning the concept of just transition, and I believe that especially now, in a situation where the global integration of value chains is not to be taken for granted that it used to be some time ago, one of the key points in order to go for the net zero and managing the idea of just transition is to incorporate, to ensure a part of the value chain, the segment of the value chain which are today abroad. Photovoltaic panels, for example, which is not only the top-end technology like ours, but probably also the most commoditized component, and also to reinforce the policies that Europe is trying to put in place on other key technologies for the energy transition, batteries, which I think is a quite good example, because probably some of you was in Brussels like me a few years ago when there was the initial debate about the battery alliance. I remember the initial meeting with Vice President Šefčovič, with big discussion. There was a lot of skepticism around. I'll be frank, it was okay that the Commission pushing this idea. Actually, there are quite a number of big factories ongoing in Europe which will produce batteries, and it's without a massive utilization of European money, by the way. So I mean, it's something which is moving. Probably it's not enough. Yes, it should be more faster. Yes, but there is some reaction on that. On hydrogen, it's clear that on this I tend to not to agree 100% of that. The idea of boosting even more the demand for gas in order to produce hydrogen, it seems to me quite counterintuitive. But it's clear that there is a need of hydrogen in the future, that there is a need of green hydrogen, which is, it's quite interesting what the REPowerEU says about this. Of course, there is a problem of to build enough renewable in order to keep this hydrogen economy on. But electrolyzers, our technology is a technology which is quite, where there is not, a gap to recover on the European side. No? There is not a clear global leader on an electrolyzer. We may play a role since the beginning of the technology deployment. It's clear that you have to work out, and it's clear that some of the tools that the REPowerEU and overall measures that Europe is putting in place, let's say the recovery fund, the recovery 2.0, the state aid, the flexibilization of some of the state aid measures may bring to this reinforcement of key segments of the value chain that today we take for granted that have to be imported. It's not. It's not. Even considering that I was saying that keeping this globalization of the value chains is not so obvious today.
So we need to keep the steel industry. I was going to call you up later. We need to keep the steel industry. We could build a hydrogen and a renewables industry. Are there any industries we cannot keep in a decarbonized Europe? Like ammonia will be the main way of trading hydrogen on ships, probably. Will we continue to make ammonia in Germany? And if not, how do we incorporate this in the carbon CFDs we are building? That would be my question, but you can also make your comment.
Yeah, that's a very hard question to ask, and expecting someone to say, "Oh, we won't have this and this and this," is probably a very unpopular thing to say. Coming back to yours, I'm going to make a shameless plug for the Innovation Fund. We are really looking at manufacturing, and we have doubled our funding volume for this year, and there's going to be dedicated windows for components manufacturing, so for heat pumps, for electrolyzers, for batteries, and for innovative renewables. And I think this also links back a bit to the question, will there be a steel industry, and which industries will there be in Europe? Because we've got to be a bit honest with ourselves what our competitive advantages are and what they are not, because probably becoming a massive exporting hydrogen producer is not the competitive advantage that Europe has. So looking at technology production and at funding things that have both a CapEx technology innovation component, like building a new type of furnace, but also use a new type of fuel, that probably has more of a priority and is playing more towards the strengths that we have here than becoming a pure commodity producer and trying to become like the world's exporter of synthetic fuels or of hydrogen. So I think, sort of answering your question, at least direction-wise, I really think industries that have a strong technological innovation component and that require both innovation on the CapEx and building new types of things side, but also using new green fuels. I think these projects have a greater chance of being successful in Europe, and Europe being successful in becoming a technology leader in these areas.
Thanks a lot. There's a lot more we could discuss, but I want to at least have 10 minutes or so of questions and discussions with all of you here. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we can then have a microphone brought to you by a very kind colleague here. And it's called a question for a reason, so please make sure it's short and it ends with a question mark. Over you, the lady.
Hi. A question for Johanna and Philip. Possibly the most contentious, green or not green technology is nuclear. Politically expedient, perhaps not a long-term solution. But the technological breakthrough we need to make it sustainable anyway, of course, is treatment of waste or stockage of waste. Is that an area for investment?
You could say your name and your affiliation. That would also
I beg your pardon. My name's Frances Cowell, and I work for an NGO called the European Network.
I think Francis knows that obviously every member state of the European Union still has sovereignty over its energy mix. Whether one can say definitely now nuclear is not part of the long-term solution, there are plenty of people who say that, but may be that there are in certain countries, they're quite happy to have nuclear as a long-term solution. But you rightly pose the question as to whether the costs of storage of waste and the treatment of waste are actually integrated into the decisions which these member states are taking. The two member states, one is Finland and the other is Sweden, if I remember rightly, who have the right geological conditions and have public acceptance for the opening of those storage facilities. As far as I understand, they are not very much used for the moment, partly because in Finland there is some delay in new or renewed capacities in nuclear generation. But clearly the message that you have to take into account within the circular economy also the issue of the treatment of waste is absolutely essential. I don't think you can say anything more than that. In terms of support from Johanna's fund or any other fund for treatment of nuclear waste, I'm sure Austria would have something to say about that, because every time the word nuclear is mentioned in an Austrian context, it's like light to a vampire, as they say.
That's not much different in Germany. I'm going to give my personal opinion. I am German, and I don't, what's the right word? For me, nuclear is not the enemy. Let's put it that way. But it's definitely outside of the fund, outside the scope of what we fund. And I do really agree with it's a cost question. I think member states have to decide their energy mix themselves, but it is a cost question. And in the past years, we've seen a lot of nuclear projects being stopped because of cost. And because the costs of decommissioning and also like the end of life costs are high and need to be priced in somehow. And often states are not willing to take on the guarantees and the insurance for these projects. So yeah, I do think this should be decided on a cost basis.
I think the gentleman in the third row there was second.
Hi, my name is Simon. I work for the German, the Association for the German Car Industry. My question is to whomever wants to answer. I think the energy demand in Europe in general, even if we try to save, will rise in the future because of technology and all other things and happening. So why, or are we focusing enough on energy partnerships with other countries? I mean, there's a huge possibility, especially in Africa, and other countries are already doing this. China, for example, and especially when it comes to hydrogen and the high energy we need to produce it, shouldn't we be way more active in, for example, Africa or South America, doing this energy partnerships right now before the markets are kind of given out without us?
Who wants to take it? Simone, should you be doing more in North Africa? I mean,
as a company, as a sector, we have been quite active on the idea of let's say, creating the condition for policymakers in order to create investibility conditions in sub-Saharan Africa, especially. That we believe is the primary. That should be the primary objective in this case, because if you consider, well, there are many different scenarios, but basically, data tend to see that to say that by the end of the decade, the energy demand in sub-Saharan Africa will more than double, which is a lot. And in the energy sector, African countries may have the chance to follow the same pattern they follow with telecommunications. So basically, jumping a technological step, going from no electricity, for example, to decentralized electricity without the need of building, 1,000 miles of HV interconnectors. There is money because there are a lot of private investors, institutional funds ready to give money for that. There is a technology. It's clear that in sub-Saharan Africa, there's no way to produce electricity cheaper than renewables. I mean, there's plenty of space, sun, wind. It's a matter of governance. Governance is a kind of passport to word in Brussels, but in this case, it's really a matter of governance. So you go there, you want to invest something, and you want to be reasonably certain that somebody will pay the bill for the next 15 years. And it's not rocket science. There is also, so we worked with this NGO which is called Renew Africa, which is where we also several utilities, banks, consultants, also Commission is pretty much aware. We discussed with Commission quite a lot about it. The idea is, okay, we prepared a kind of model, of institutional model, of how to create the right framework to enable private investments. We are not asking for money or subsidies, just, the right framework, because at the end of the day, the customers will pay the bill, and the bill will be cheaper through this technology with another technology. And well, it's a partial answer to your question, but of course, I believe it's a priority, because there is no way to look at the future in a sustainable way, where sustainable means environmentally, climate, but also socially, without a strong plan for sub-Saharan Africa, which will, again, double the energy demand, grow in terms of demography. It's really a priority for us.
We have time for one final short question and then one short answer, and then yeah, we should close the panel. Is there a microphone? Yeah, sorry, the gentleman in the second row.
Thank you. Well, I'm coming from a country of stability, Turkey. So we have in terms of electricity demand and energy demand, the electricity demand will be increasing double than the energy demand. It's a global fact, and it will apply in Europe as well. So we have a very gloomy view here in the short term, and yet the panelists even didn't talk about the results of the unfortunate war in Ukraine, which will bring more uncertainties and some more variables into this equation. And we have been seeing some unprecedented events and very unprecedented
Could you catch
times.
the question? Sorry.
Sure. So the most vulnerable part of Europe will be southern, eastern, and eastern Europe in terms of electricity, and for various reasons. One, supplier dominance and lack of interconnections, also untapped renewable potential. So Mediterranean region will be a key. And Frans Timmermans was in Ankara last month for high-level dialogue for climate. And Turkey has a great potential in terms of green hydrogen and hydrogen. The installed power capacity is...
Sorry, is there a question there? Sorry.
54% of installed capacity in Turkey is renewable. So do you think, it's a question for all panelists, do you think the Repower EU plan will be more inclusive in terms of win-win opportunities to create better solutions for the short term? Thank you.
Philip, do you want to take this? Yeah, I think it's working. Yeah.
Just check with my friend at the back there who tells me whether I'm speaking loud enough. Well, I mean, first of all, any rational diversification of sources of energy, whether it's of the same energy type or not, is implicit in the Repower strategy, and that's good. And secondly, when you're talking about countries which have a land or sea frontier with the countries of the European Union, there is huge advantage in interconnection, not simply for the possibilities of import or export, but also for the systems themselves that become more resilient and more difficult to, easier to manage when the network is wider and could be, as is suggested, expanded to the east of Europe. But the experience with some of the plans of this kind, like Desertec, was a bit mixed, because if you want to have a real integrated partnership with another another country which is either producing or consuming energy, then you have to recognize that they have their own political, social priorities too, their own issues of accessibility for the population, their own issues of the competitiveness of their economy. And I think that some of the countries who are our neighbors are not always interested in partnering, because they may have the impression that, in fact, the partnership is not for their mutual benefit as well, but for the benefit of Europe to exploit these sources of energy which are lower. And so if you're in a Maghreb country and you don't deal with the affordability and accessibility of electricity in their own countries first, then they will have less interest in going wider. But as far as Turkey and maybe Israel and others are concerned, subject to the distance is concerned, electricity is a potential area of cooperation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Philip. This leads me to close the panel. I know we're finishing a little bit late, but we also started a little bit late, so I think that's. I hope that's all right. Before we have lunch, we are very fortunate to have some closing remarks from Carlos Zoinho, who is a member of the European Parliament and works on a lot of the issues we discussed today within the EP. Carlos, the floor is yours. Yeah, you can just walk up to the lectern.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for United Europe, Future and Aurora to give me this opportunity to learn with so well-prepared and experienced panel. As member of the European Parliament, you are exactly now working in these issues, working in the short-term issues, trying to create the conditions to put in work the REPowerEU plan, and also to work in more structural issues. For instance, this week in the European Parliament, we are preparing the votes that we will have next week in the plenary. Next week in the plenary, we will vote all the reports that are included in the Fit for 55 package. For instance, I participate in all the negotiations, I make a lot of amendments, but I'm a rapporteur in name of my group, S&D, of the CBAM. And for instance, in the CBAM mechanism, I fight for decarbonisation combined with industry modernization, sustainable development, and also I think it's very, very important to align the emission of the CBAM certificates and the phasing out of the free licenses with the technological maturity. I think this is very important and very critical for the final success of the process. The debate and the vote in the Parliament at this moment, I think, will be impracticable. And after we have a very interesting debate, trilogue with the Council, with the support of the Commission. Only to share with you 4 or 5 ideas about the subject of this panel. I think that before the war, and especially after the start of the war, the European industry needs an holistic and a strategic change. To stay at the same place is not a solution. To go back is not also a solution. And a new combination between energy and information with a new ground of knowledge, technology and innovation, the fund of innovation, for instance, is needed. The change is extremely important because we need a strong and competitive industry if you want to achieve the targets of the Green Deal, and also if you want to achieve the targets of the Fit for 55 package. We need also a strong industry to enforce the digital decade and to lead a smart and inclusive digital transition. So, in this issue, the old question to know if the chicken or the egg was born first don't make sense. Industry, energy transition, and digital transition need to develop together. At the same time, war and energy crisis need to be addressed together with strategic autonomy. I will not speak about that. I love to speak about that. I'm also the president of the European, co-president of the Joint Parliamentary Assembly, European Union, Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific. We are now developing the partnerships under the Global Europe, under the Global Gateway, waiting for that Hungary could give us finally the post-Cotonou agreement. The GPA is the second greater joint parliamentary assembly in the world. I think this is also very important for the global relevance of European Union, and the geopolitics of energy, the geopolitics of information is a very crucial issue, but is not the subject of today. I think that we need to address the war and the energy prices and the modernization of industry with strategic autonomy, with efficiency, with renewable interconnections and storage, and with a just transition and a smart transition. Give you an example that I think is noted today in the panel. I'm Portuguese. Portugal, for instance, you have a very deep port scenes. Is absolutely possible with a third interconnection through Spain, but also with transshipment to receive a lot of LNG from North Africa and from the United States in this period of smart transition, not a structural solution, but a smart transition. And we need also to develop a strong data space for energy and industry joint development. Now, in the past, when I come to the European Parliament, we talk a lot about the intergovernmental policies, the communitarian policies, but now the pandemic, also the war, shows that we need to have a common, shared database to work in different perspectives, sometimes in the global, in the European perspective, sometimes in a national perspective, but with the common framework, common knowledge, with interconnection of solutions and flexibility of solutions. So you need to develop a strong data space for energy and industry joint development with regulatory certainty. And what means regulatory certainty means that need to be flexible to adapt to reality, but transparent and trustable in the framework. If that means a new market design, I don't know, but it means something different. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and thank you very much to all our panelists today. I thought this was, well, we could have had the discussion for twice as long because there's so many big topics here, but really interesting. I learned a lot. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us here. Thank you for joining us online, and yeah, looking forward to lunch together. Thank you.